For 3 days, every healer in the kingdom had knelt beside the Alpha King and failed. His heart still beat, slow, hollow, like a war drum heard from the wrong side of a grave. His chest rose and fell only because the royal mages forced it to, their hands trembling above him in 8-hour shifts, their faces carved with the particular grief of people watching something inevitable. The kingdom's finest physicians had exhausted every remedy, every ancient text, every whispered prayer to gods who no longer answered. His mind was gone. His soul, they said, was already halfway across the veil. The kingdom had quietly begun to mourn, until 2 small children wandered into the most sacred, most forbidden, most heavily guarded room in the realm, and did something no one could explain. What no one expected, least of all Lyra, was that when his eyes finally opened, burning gold and wild and terrifyingly alive, he wouldn't look at the healers who had fought for him. He wouldn't look at the guards who had sworn their lives to him. He would look at her. And by the time she understood what her children had done, it would already be too late to run. The job was supposed to be simple. Lyra pressed her back against the cold stone of the corridor wall and counted her breaths the way her mother had taught her. 4 counts in, hold for 7, release like river water finding its level. Slow, controlled, invisible. She was supposed to be delivering a basin of warm medicinal water to the night healers in the East Wing. She was supposed to be back in the servants' quarters within the quarter hour. And she was supposed to know exactly where her children were. She was 0 for 3. She'd brought them tonight because there had been no other choice. The old woman who minded them in the lower quarters had taken ill by midday, and the shift supervisor didn't accept explanations, only results or replacements. Lyra could not afford to lose this position. Not this week. Not with winter pressing down on the lower city like a fist, and the twins growing faster than she could patch their boots. They'd been perfect on the long walk up from the servant gates, perfect through the winding back corridors, through the warmth of the kitchen passage, through the echo of marble halls that her children had never seen before and regarded with wide, reverent silence. She had stationed them on a carved stone bench outside the East Wing corridor, given them each a heel of bread, looked them both in the eye with the particular gravity she reserved for serious things, and said the words clearly. Do not move. Do not speak to anyone. Do not touch anything. She'd been gone 11 minutes. Now the door to the Alpha King's outer chamber stood open. Not ajar, not accidentally swung. Open, as though someone small had pushed it with both hands and simply walked through. That door was never open. Lyra had been working this wing for 3 days, ever since the royal household had put out a desperate call for additional staff to manage the swelling household during the king's crisis. She had watched the guards check that iron bolt on every single shift change, a solemn, wordless ritual, 2 men pressing their palms to the lock as if confirming something sacred still held. She had heard them speak of it in low voices. No one enters, not without the head healer, not without the council seal, not for any reason. The basin nearly slipped from her hands. She set it down on the hallway bench. Her pulse climbed her throat. She should find a guard. She should turn around and walk quickly and pretend she had seen nothing. An Omega had no business this deep in the royal wing, no right to concern herself with sacred doors and forbidden chambers, and the fates of kings who existed in a world so far above her own, she had spent 6 years deliberately forgetting it. 6 years, 11 months, and some handful of days, if she was counting precisely. She was not counting. She walked toward the open door on silent feet, because she could hear her son's voice on the other side of it. Hushed and careful, at the specific tone Emre used when he was being what he called extremely responsible. She said, "Don't touch anything." "I'm not touching anything." Her daughter's voice, patient, logical. "I'm holding it near him. That's different." "Raya." "He's sad, Emre. Can't you feel it? He's been sad for a long time." Lyra's hand hit the door. It swung wide, The chamber was vast and golden, the kind of room that existed to remind anyone who entered it of their own smallness. Silk draped every surface. Candles burned in iron stands taller than men. The scent of healing herbs, and something older, something mineral and storm-dark, pressed against her like a wall. And there, on the grand bed at the center of it all, lay the Alpha King. He was, even now, even motionless and silent and absent from himself, the most physically commanding man she had ever seen. Dark hair against ivory silk, a jaw cut like weathered stone, a chest that rose and fell with the shallow, mechanical breath of the magically sustained, his body betraying none of the weakness that had taken his mind. She had spent 6 years trying to forget that face. Her son stood at the king's bedside, small hand pressed gently to the king's temple, head tilted in concentration. Her daughter had climbed onto the bed itself. In her outstretched fingers, a violet flower pulsed with soft, impossible light, shimmering the way things shimmer in dreams. And she was carefully, deliberately, tucking it behind the king's ear. "Get away from him," Lyra hissed, stepping forward. "Right now, both of you." Her son turned, also looked at the man sleeping beneath his hand, and said, with the full and quiet certainty of a child who has never once doubted what they feel, "Dad?" The king's fingers twitched. Time stopped. Not the way it stops in moments of beauty or relief. The way it stops when something impossible is happening directly in front of you, and your mind simply refuses to process it fast enough to act. Lyra stood frozen in the doorway of the most forbidden room in the kingdom, watching her son's small hand rest against the temple of the brain-dead Alpha King, and she could not make her legs move. "Emre." Her voice came out wrong, too thin, too careful, the way voices go when panic hasn't decided yet whether to become a scream. "Step back from him, right now." Emre didn't look at her. That was the part that frightened her most. Not the guards who would come, not the consequences she could already feel assembling themselves into a catastrophe at the edges of her mind, but the way her son wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the king with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Focused, still, like a child listening to something only he could hear. "He's far away," Emre said quietly. "Really far. Raya, get down from that bed." "Almost," her daughter murmured, and pressed the glowing flower more firmly behind the king's ear. Lyra crossed the room in 4 steps and reached for her daughter's arm. She got close enough to see him properly. She wished, immediately, that she hadn't. Up close, the Alpha King was devastating in his stillness. He had always been a man who commanded space simply by existing in it. She knew that, had known it once in a way she had spent years burying, but she had not prepared herself for what it would mean to see all of that power rendered completely silent. His face was calm in the way of deep water. No pain, no dreaming. No flicker of the person who had once. She stopped that thought before it finished forming. His chest rose. Fell. The breath was shallow, mechanical, a borrowed rhythm that belonged to the mages sustaining him, and not to the man himself. His hands lay open at his sides, palms up, like someone who had put down a great weight and not yet found the strength to pick it up again. The healers were right. He wasn't here. Whatever had made King Kael, the force of him, the weight of his presence, the thing that made hardened warriors lower their eyes when he entered a room, it was absent. There was only the body, beautiful and still and empty as an abandoned throne. Lyra reached for Raya. "Wake up, Dad." Her daughter's voice was soft, conversational, the tone she used when rousing Emre from heavy sleep, gentle, patient, certain that eventually it would work. "Raya!" The king's chest rose, not the shallow borrowed rise of the mage's work. Something deeper. Something from inside. Lyra's hand closed around nothing. The glowing flower pulsed, once, twice, violet light bleeding into gold at its edges, and where Emre's palm pressed against the king's temple, the air seemed to thicken, to hum, the way the sky hums in the second before lightning makes its decision. "Come back," Raya said. "We found you." The king's fingers moved. All 5 of them, slowly, curling inward like a man reaching for something in a dream. Lyra stopped breathing. "No," she whispered. It came out like a prayer and a warning at once. "No, no, no." The Alpha King inhaled. It was not the thin, maintained breath of a dying body. It was enormous. A sudden, violent reclamation of air, his chest surging upward, his back arching slightly off the silk, every muscle in his body firing at once as though something had slammed back into him from a very great distance. And then his eyes opened. Gold. Burning, wild, furious gold. Not the careful burnished gold of a man in control of himself, but the raw, blinding gold of a predator surfacing from somewhere very dark and finding light for the first time. Irises blown wide, pupils contracting sharply against the candlelight. The room exploded. The guards came through the side doors first, drawn by some alarm Lyra hadn't even heard. 6 of them in full silver armor flooding the chamber with steel and shouting. The head healer appeared from the alcove, her instruments clattering to the floor in a sound like broken bells. Someone at the back of the room made a noise that was almost a scream. Someone else was calling for the council, for the mages, for anyone. The king didn't look at any of them. His gaze moved across the chaos like it was smoke, passing through it, dismissing it, searching. It found the twins first. He looked at them for a long moment, breathing in rough, deep pulls, his chest working like a man who had forgotten how lungs operated and was relearning in real time. Something moved through his expression that Lyra had no word for. Then his eyes moved. To her. The gold steadied. His voice came out wrecked, raw and stripped and scraped hollow, the voice of a man returning from somewhere language didn't reach. "You came back." The room kept moving around her. Guards shouting, healers rushing. The world reassembling itself around an impossible miracle. Lyra couldn't hear any of it, because he was looking at her the way people look at things they thought they had lost forever. And he knew her name. She could see it, sitting right behind his eyes, waiting. He remembered. They separated her from the twins within minutes. Not roughly, no one touched her, no one raised a voice. But the royal guard had a particular way of surrounding a person that made resistance feel not just futile but somehow embarrassing, and Lyra found herself steered into a small antechamber off the main corridor before she had fully processed that it was happening. A woman in healer's gray took the children with practiced, efficient kindness, offering them something warm to drink and steering them toward a cushioned bench with the cheerful authority of someone accustomed to managing frightened small people. Raya went without complaint, already studying the ceiling murals with the calm curiosity of a child who found the world endlessly interesting. Emre looked back at Lyra once. "It's all right," she mouthed. He didn't look convinced, but he went. The door closed. Lyra sat in the antechamber and did not let herself shake. Outside, the palace had lost its mind. She could hear it through the walls. The rapid percussion of boots on marble, the overlapping voices of healers and advisors and council members all arriving at the same impossible conclusion and finding it did not fit any framework they possessed. The Alpha King had been brain-dead for 3 days. The Alpha King had just inhaled like a man surfacing from deep water and opened his eyes. The Alpha King had looked at a servant woman and spoken 4 words that no one in the room could adequately explain. "You came back." Lyra pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. 4 in, 7 out, steady as a river. The door opened. The guard who appeared was senior, silver-streaked, broad-shouldered, wearing the particular expression of a man following orders he didn't fully understand yet. "His Majesty is asking for you," he said, not a request. They had moved the king to a smaller chamber, still grand by any reasonable standard, but intimate in comparison to the vast ceremonial room where he had lain for 3 days. He was sitting up against the headboard when they brought her in, a fur thrown across his lap. 2 healers hovering at the edges of the room with the anxious energy of people who had been told to stay present, but not interfere. He looked. Not well. Not the word she would have chosen. His color was wrong, slightly, the particular pallor of someone whose body had been running on borrowed power for too long, and there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested the return to consciousness had not been painless. But he was present. Fully, terrifyingly present, in a way that had nothing to do with his physical condition and everything to do with the quality of his attention, which was currently directed entirely at Lyra in a way that made the room feel smaller than it was. She stopped at a respectful distance and kept her eyes low. Old instinct. Safe instinct. "Leave us," he said. The healers exchanged a glance. "Your Majesty, your condition. Leave." They left. The silence that followed was the particular kind that has weight to it. "Come closer," he said. "I won't ask you to kneel." She approached, stopped 2 arms' lengths away. Close enough to be addressed, far enough, she hoped, to think clearly. He was watching her with those gold eyes that had steadied now into something more controlled, still burning, but focused. The gaze of a man assembling something carefully from pieces he wasn't entirely sure fit together yet. "I know you," he said. "No, Your Majesty." Her voice came out level. She had rehearsed this, in the 30 seconds she'd had to rehearse anything. "I'm a servant. I've been working the East Wing 3 days. They brought in additional staff when... I know what you smell like." The words landed quietly, without aggression, which somehow made them worse. "Your Majesty." 7 years is a long time, he said, but scent doesn't change, not the way that matters. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite confusion, but something uncomfortably positioned between them. "You were there, in the dark, while I was..." He paused, something flickering behind his eyes. There was a voice, pulling me back. I couldn't see anything, couldn't find anything to hold on to, but there was a voice. Lyra said nothing. "I thought I'd invented it," he continued. "The healers said the mind constructs things in that state. Familiar things, comforting things." His jaw tightened. "But you're standing in front of me and you are not constructed." "I think," Lyra said carefully, "that you may be remembering something that isn't..." "You disappeared," he said, 7 years ago." The air left the room. She felt it go, felt the careful architecture of her composure develop a crack straight down its center. And she held absolutely still because stillness was the only thing she had left to offer. And if she moved, even slightly, he would see it. He was watching her with complete attention. And in his eyes, slow, like ice beginning to fracture in early spring, something was waking up that had been buried far longer than 3 days. He was remembering. Not everything. Not yet. But the door was open. And Lyra had no idea how to close it. She had never told anyone. Not the full truth of it. Not the shape of that night. Not the name of the man who had arranged it. Not the way she had woken in a strange room with golden light pressing through unfamiliar curtains, and the absolute certainty that her life had just divided itself permanently into before and after. She had packed what little she carried, walked out of the Eastern Territories before sunrise, and spent 7 years becoming someone that night could not find. She had almost believed it had worked. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. 7 years earlier. The exchange was called a diplomatic posting. That was the word Lord Chiron had used when he'd summoned her. Posting, as though she were correspondence being redirected, as though an Omega's relocation from one pack service to another was an administrative matter, and not what it actually was, which was a transaction. A favor rendered in human currency between 2 men who wanted something from each other, and had identified her as the most convenient denomination. She had been 19, low-ranking, without family connections or pack protection or any of the particular armor that might have made her refusal worth the energy of a response. She went. The Eastern Palace was nothing like the stories. Colder, more beautiful, the kind of beautiful that doesn't invite you in. She was assigned to the lower household staff and given clear instructions. Attend to her duties. Remain in her designated quarters. Do not draw attention. She had followed those instructions with perfect faithfulness for 11 days. On the 12th, Lord Chiron had knocked on her door after midnight. "There's been a change," he'd said, "in your assignment." She hadn't understood at first what she was being led toward. The royal wing was lit differently at night. Warmer, the candles burning amber instead of white. And the guards at each checkpoint had stepped aside for Chiron with the careful non-expression of men being paid to have poor memories. She had understood, by the 3rd checkpoint, that something was wrong. She had understood by the 5th, that understanding it would not help her. The king's private chamber had smelled of wine and something beneath wine. Sharper, chemical, wrong. He had been sitting in a chair by the window. Not asleep. Not quite conscious either. His head was tipped back at an angle that spoke of something administered rather than chosen. His hands loose in his lap. His breathing slow in a way that was not peaceful. He was, even like that, even diminished by whatever Chiron had put in his wine, the most physically overwhelming person she had ever been in a room with. Alpha presence radiated from him like heat from stone, even suppressed, even stolen. She had looked at Chiron. "You'll serve the king tonight," Chiron had said pleasantly, "and in the morning, this won't have happened." Then he had left. And locked the door. Present. Lyra became aware that she had been silent for too long. The king was watching her with the particular patience of someone who has decided not to push. Not yet. But whose stillness is itself a kind of pressure. His gold eyes had not moved from her face. Whatever he was reading there, she couldn't prevent him from reading it. She had run out of the kind of composure that conceals things. "I was in the Eastern Territories," she said finally. "Briefly. 7 years ago." She kept her voice flat, factual, a woman relaying information she had no personal investment in. "I was part of Lord Chiron's household staff, on a posting." Something shifted in his expression at Chiron's name. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Something that had already suspected and was now receiving confirmation. "And the children," he said quietly. "Are mine," she said immediately. "They are mine, Your Majesty. That is the only relevant—" "How old are they?" The question was gentle, precise as a blade. Lyra said nothing. "Lyra." Her name in his mouth was a catastrophe she had not prepared for. He said it the way people say things they've been carrying for a long time. Not casually, not experimentally, but with the particular weight of something retrieved from a very specific place. 6, she said. "They're 6 years old." The silence that followed was the kind that does the mathematics on its own. She watched him do it. Watched the number settle behind his eyes. Watched him place it against the timeline of what he was slowly reconstructing. Watched the calculation complete itself in the stillness of his expression. They pulled me back," he said. It wasn't a question. He was thinking aloud, assembling something. "The healers. The head healer told me just before you arrived. She said whatever the children did it wasn't a child wandering into a room and saying the wrong name. She said the life signatures they recorded the moment my eyes opened." He paused. "She said it looked like a soul retrieval. Old magic. Blood-deep magic." His gaze sharpened. "The kind that only works between direct bloodline?" "Children are unpredictable," Lyra said. "Their abilities are inherited," he said, "from somewhere." "Your Majesty." "I was drugged that night." His voice didn't rise. It dropped, actually. Quieter, more controlled, the register of someone choosing precision over volume. "I have known that for 7 years. I knew something happened that I couldn't account for, and I knew Chiron was involved, and then you were gone, and I had nothing to—" He stopped, drew a slow breath. I had dreams while I was, wherever I was. A woman's voice, calling me back. Lyra's throat tightened. It wasn't a dream, he said. She said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, with the careful precision of a man who has decided to stop walking around something and simply ask, "Are they mine?" She made her decision somewhere around the 3rd hour of the night. Not impulsively. Lyra had not done anything impulsively since she was 19 years old, and impulsivity had cost her everything. She lay on the narrow cot they'd given her in the East Wing guest quarters, she staring at the ceiling while her children slept curled together in the larger bed across the room. Raya's golden curls spread across Emre's shoulder, both of them breathing with the unconscious peace of children who did not yet understand what they had done. She watched them for a long time. Then she got up, dressed in the dark, and began to pack. It didn't take long. 6 years of careful living had made her efficient. She owned nothing that couldn't fit into a single canvas bag, had made sure of that deliberately, the way you make sure of things when some part of you has always known that one day you would need to leave quickly. She woke the twins with a soft hand and a finger pressed to her lips. They were good at silence, her children. They had learned it early. "Where are we going, Mama?" Oh, Emre signed with his hands rather than speaking, a private language they developed in the years when quiet had meant safety. "Home," she signed back. They didn't have a home. He knew that. But he also understood what she meant by it, which was away from here. And that was enough. She had mapped the servant's exit 3 days ago, the first morning of her posting, because mapping exits was the first thing she did in any new place. Down the back staircase, through the kitchen passage, out through the supply yard, where the pre-dawn delivery carts would provide adequate cover. Simple. Clean. Gone before the palace woke to the full weight of yesterday's miracle and began asking the questions she couldn't answer. She made it as far as the bottom of the staircase. He was standing in the corridor. Not in state dress. No crown, no council formality. He wore a plain dark shirt, unlaced at the throat, and the fur-lined coat of someone who had dressed for function rather than appearance. He looked like a man who had not slept, which she suspected was accurate. He also looked considerably more steady than he had any right to, given that 30 hours ago he had been brain-dead. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and when she appeared at the base of the stairs with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a child's hand in each of hers, he looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise. "I thought dawn," he said. "I expected you earlier, actually." Lyra stopped. Emre pressed closer to her side. Raya, characteristically, looked at the king with frank and fearless curiosity. "You were waiting for me," Lyra said. "I was waiting for this," he corrected. "They're different things." He straightened from the wall, unhurried. "I'm not going to stop you with force. I want to be clear about that. You're not a prisoner." "Then step aside." "I can't do that either." He said it without apology, but also without hardness. "Not until you tell me what they are, what they can actually do. Because I have a dead court physician. Dead 3 months ago, ruled natural causes. And a head healer who told me this morning that the magical signatures recorded during what happened yesterday don't match any documented form of healing she has ever encountered in 40 years of practice." The corridor was cold and very quiet. "They're children," Lyra said. "Yes," he agreed. "Extraordinary ones." She looked at her twins. Emre was watching the king with his head tilted slightly, the expression he wore when he was sensing something, listening to something below the surface of the audible world. Raya had not looked away from Kyle since they'd appeared at the foot of the stairs. "He has a hole in him," Raya said conversationally, to no one in particular. "Here." She pressed her small hand briefly to her own sternum, where something was taken out. Kyle looked at the girl. Lyra closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she set down the canvas bag. "They don't just heal," she said quietly. "They restore. There's a difference." She chose her words with the care of someone dismantling something dangerous. Healing closes wounds. What they do is older than that. They can sense when something has been removed from a person. A memory, a will, a soul that's been pushed somewhere it didn't choose to go. She met his eyes. And sometimes they can call it back. The king was very still. "The physicians said I had a catastrophic neurological event," he said slowly. "Spontaneous, unexplained, no physical cause they could identify." "Because it wasn't physical." The words settled between them like stones dropped into still water. She watched him understand it. Watched the architecture of what he'd accepted as misfortune rearrange itself into something with intent behind it. His jaw tightened. "Someone did this to me." "Someone tried to erase you," Lyra said. "Not kill you. Erasure is more useful than death. A living king with no mind is a body that signs documents and makes no objections." She held his gaze. "See, whoever did it knew enough about forbidden magic to use it without leaving a physical trace. And they did it from inside this palace." "Karen," he said. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But whoever it was, they will know the children woke you. They will know what that means." Her voice stayed level through an act of pure will. "And they will want to know what else my children can do." Kyle looked at the twins for a long moment. Then he looked at her. And whatever he saw in her face, it moved through his expression like weather. "You've known this was possible," he said. "That's why you ran, 6 years ago. Not just from me, from anyone who might notice what they were." She said nothing, which was its own answer. He opened his mouth to respond. The palace shook, a sound like the world splitting at its foundations. A concussive roar from the eastern tower that rattled the corridor stones and sent a chandelier swinging violently overhead. Dust fell from the ceiling in pale curtains. Somewhere above them, glass shattered. Then the screaming started. Lyra grabbed both children and pulled them against her. Kyle was already moving, transformed in an instant from a man in recovery to something that had always been underneath. Something that wore statecraft as a costume and war as its native tongue. He turned back once. "Stay close," he said. "Whatever happens, stay close to me." The eastern tower was on fire. Lyra could see it from the inner courtyard. A column of black smoke rising against the pale pre-dawn sky, lit orange from beneath. The kind of fire that doesn't start from accidents. Controlled, deliberate. Placed precisely where it would create maximum chaos without immediately destroying anything structurally critical. A warning, then. Or an entrance. The palace had transformed around them in the 4 minutes since the explosion. Guards moved in formation through every corridor, the unhurried precision of trained men executing a protocol they had rehearsed enough times to run on reflex. Servants had disappeared into the interior rooms as though the walls had swallowed them. The council members who'd been summoned through the night for the king's recovery were now congregating in the great hall with the anxious, self-important energy of people who wanted to be seen responding to a crisis without being anywhere near it. Kyle moved through all of it like a current moves through water, not against it, but reshaping it simply by passing through. People stepped aside. Decisions deferred themselves to his presence. Whatever the last 3 days had taken from him physically, it had taken nothing from the particular gravity that made rooms reorganize around him. Lyra kept her children close and followed because the alternative was standing still in a burning palace, and she had not survived 6 years of careful invisibility by making bad tactical decisions. They reached the main gates as the outer guard line reformed, and there, across the courtyard, she saw him. She recognized him before she recognized his face. It was the way he stood, that particular stillness of a man who has never once in his life worried about what came next, because he has always been the one deciding it. Broad-shouldered, dark-cloaked, positioned at the head of a war party that had breached the outer gates with the kind of efficiency that required either very good intelligence or someone on the inside providing access. Lord Karen, 7 years older. Silver threading his dark hair now, which suited him in the way that aging suits men who have always possessed more power than conscience. He stood in the center of the courtyard, with his hands loose at his sides, and a smile that had never once in Lyra's experience reached his eyes. Behind him, 30 armed men. And beside him, a figure in dark robes who stood very still and watched the palace with the focused attention of someone reading something the rest of them couldn't see. Lyra pulled her children tighter against her and stepped behind the pillar at Kael's left. Too slow. Karen's gaze had already found her. She watched it happen. The slight adjustment of his attention. The way his smile shifted from political performance to something more personal and considerably more cold. "Lyra," he called across the courtyard. His voice carried easily, designed for rooms and for performance, and for the particular power of speaking a name loudly in front of witnesses. "I wondered if you'd still be here. Most sensible women would have run." Kael went very still beside her. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of a predator who has just identified a target and is deciding how long to wait before moving. "Karen," he said. One word. The temperature of it was below freezing. "Your Majesty." The title came out like a thing Chiron had picked up off the floor and was holding at arm's length. "I'll confess, I didn't expect you to be vertical. I was prepared for a regency conversation." He tilted his head. "Someone has been busy." "You burned my tower," Kael said. "I knocked," Karen replied pleasantly. The gate mechanism was unresponsive. The council members behind Lyra were doing the rapid, whispered calculations of people who understood political structures and were currently watching one threaten to collapse. She could hear them. Eastern territories, trade agreements, border treaties, the particular vocabulary of men trying to locate a crisis inside a framework it had already escaped. "What do you want?" Kael said. Not a question. A formality he was extending for the sake of the witnesses, to establish on the record that he had asked. Chiron's gaze moved from the king, deliberately, insultingly slowly, back to Lyra. "You know what I want," he said. "I've known about them since the village outside Dunmore 3 years ago. The boy who found the miller's drowned dog and stood over it for a long moment, and then it wasn't drowned anymore." A pause. "You moved quickly after that. I'll give you credit. But trails exist whether you intend them or not." Emre pressed his face against Lyra's side. She could feel him trembling. Not in fear, she realized, but in the particular way he trembled when he was sensing something very large and very wrong in close proximity. Raya was not trembling. Raya was watching Chiron with an expression that, on a 6-year-old's face, should not have been possible. Flat, knowing, old. "He's broken inside," she said quietly to her brother. "Everything he touches, he breaks. He doesn't notice." Chiron heard her. Something moved across his face that was not quite discomfort and not quite recognition, but lived in the territory between them. "Remarkable," he said softly. Kael stepped forward. One step, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of movement that is itself a statement. The gold in his eyes had shifted into something that was no longer entirely human, the wolf beneath the man making its presence known at the surface. "You will turn your party around," he said very quietly. "You will remove yourself from my gates, and then I will decide whether to consider this a political incident or a declaration." Karen smiled. "I'm afraid that's not how this works anymore." He looked past the king, directly at the twins, with the focused appetite of a collector identifying something rare. "Those children were conceived on my arrangement, in my territory, as part of a transaction that was never completed." His voice didn't rise, didn't need to. "Under Eastern Pack law, that makes them assets of my house." He let it land. Then, In the ringing silence that followed, those children belong to me now. Kyle shifted, not metaphorically. The sound of it was brief and total, a crack like a great tree coming down. And then where the king had been standing there was something else entirely. Something vast and black and furious, a wolf the size of a destrier with gold eyes burning like twin fires in the gray pre-dawn light. The war party across the courtyard took one involuntary step back. Karen did not step back, but his smile, for the first time, faltered. The wolf moved like a storm with intent. Lyra had heard stories about the Alpha King and his shifted form. Every Omega in the lower city had. The kind of stories that circulated in hushed voices over washing basins and evening fires. Stories that functioned simultaneously as warning and legend. She had categorized them as exaggeration, the particular mythology that accumulates around powerful men, inflated by fear and retelling until the original fact is barely visible underneath. She had been wrong. Kale crossed the courtyard in 4 strides and hit the front line of Chiron's war party, like a wave hitting a cliff face, not breaking against them, but through them, scattering armed men with the casual, devastating efficiency of something that exists at a fundamentally different scale than the things it moves through. A soldier went airborne. 2 more stumbled back in the same motion. Steel rang against the cobblestones where weapons had been dropped by men who had understood in the first half-second of contact that what they were holding was irrelevant. The palace guard surged forward behind him. The courtyard became a collision. Lyra pulled the twins back through the pillar archway and into the interior corridor, putting stone between her children and the open air. The sounds of the battle were immediate and dissonant. Steel, shouting, the crack of something heavy meeting something harder. A vocabulary of violence that made her stomach drop even as she forced herself to think clearly. Think. Exits. Options. The servant stairs were 20 feet to her left. The kitchen passage beyond that. If she could reach the supply yard before Chiron's men had circled the exterior. Mama. Emre's voice. Low and urgent. She looked down. He was staring at the corridor ahead of them. The long internal passage that ran parallel to the courtyard, lit by wall-mounted torches that threw unsteady amber light across the stone. Empty. Except it wasn't. A figure stepped out of the shadows at the far end. Dark robes. The same figure she had noticed beside Karen in the courtyard, the one who had stood still while everything else moved, watching the palace with that peculiar focused attention. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected. Sharp-featured, pale, with eyes that caught the torchlight in a way that was slightly wrong, slightly too reflective, like something behind them was doing the looking. The blood mage. He looked at Lyra with the polite disinterest of a professional assessing an obstacle. Then he looked at the twins with something else entirely. There they are, he said softly. Not to Lyra, to himself, or to something she couldn't see. I wondered if they'd be more impressive in person. He tilted his head. They are. Lyra stepped in front of her children. Whatever Chiron is paying you. Lord Chiron is not my patron, the mage said, with a faint inflection that suggested the correction mattered to him. I was retained for a specific purpose. The children. He reached into his robe and withdrew something small. A vial of dark liquid that moved against gravity, sluggish and wrong. I'll be straightforward with you. You're not my target. If you step aside, this becomes considerably simpler for everyone. That, Lyra said, is not something that is going to happen. She grabbed the nearest torch from its bracket. It wasn't a sword. It wasn't even a particularly good weapon. But it was fire. And fire didn't require training. And when she swung it toward the mage, he stepped back with the first unguarded movement she'd seen from him. Genuine, reflexive, which told her that for all his controlled stillness, he was still a body that understood self-preservation. She didn't pursue. She turned, grabbed both children, and ran. She made it as far as the junction before she understood that the mage had not been the real problem. The corridor to the right was blocked. Not by people, by 3 members of the palace's own inner guard, standing in formation across the passage with their expressions set in the blank, deliberate way of men who have made a decision they've finished second-guessing. Palace guard, royal livery, the silver insignia of the king's own household, standing between her and the exit. One of them met her eyes. Something moved in his expression. Not guilt, exactly, but the cousin of it. The acknowledgement that she was seeing something she was not supposed to see. Someone helped them get in. The thought arrived with horrible clarity. The gate mechanism. Karen's war party moving through the palace's corridors without triggering the inner alarms. The blood mage positioned inside the building before the attack had even begun. Someone had opened the doors. She had no time to process it. The mage had followed. She could feel it. The particular pressure of blood magic in close proximity. A sensation she had learned to identify over 6 years of protecting children who attracted the wrong kind of attention. Like barometric pressure dropping before a storm. "Emre," she said. "Raya, hold on to each other." "Mama," Raya started. The mage's voice came from behind her, calm as a man reading from a list. "Vinculum." The word hit the air like a stone hitting still water, except the ripple moved wrong, inward instead of out. And Lyra felt it pass through her like cold water finding the spaces between bones. It didn't touch her. It found the twins. Emre made a sound she had never heard from him before. Sharp, surprised, cut off. And she spun in time to see both children suspended, perfectly still, their feet 2 inches off the ground, surrounded by a lattice of dark light that pulsed with the mage's slow, steady heartbeat. Raya's eyes were wide. Emre's hand was outstretched toward his sister, frozen mid-reach. Neither of them could move. "There," the mage said quietly. "That's much simpler." Lyra lunged. The traitor guards caught her before she reached them. 2 of them, efficient and impersonal, and no matter how she fought, how she twisted, the physics of it were simply not in her favor. She screamed, not in fear, in fury. Somewhere across the palace, through stone walls and the chaos of battle, she heard the wolf howl, a sound that shook the corridor stones and extinguished 2 torches in their brackets. But the mage was already moving toward her children, and the traitor guards held. The mage reached for Emre first. Lyra saw his hand extend toward her son, unhurried, clinical, the movement of a professional who has done this before and expects it to take approximately as long as it takes. And something in her simply broke. Not collapsed, not surrendered. Broke, the way a dam breaks, the way a thing that has been holding enormous pressure for a very long time finally meets the force that exceeds it. And what comes through is not weakness, but everything that was being held back. She drove her elbow into the guard's ribs with everything she had. He grunted. His grip shifted. It was enough, barely, stupidly enough, for her to wrench one arm free and lunge forward, placing herself between the mage's outstretched hand and her son's suspended, motionless body. The mage's fingers caught her forearm instead. The pain was immediate and total. Not heat. Cold, actually. The specific cold of something being read. Her blood suddenly legible to something that had no right to read it. Her body's history ransacked in a single second, like a room being searched by someone who doesn't care what they damage. She heard herself make a sound. Then she heard Raya. Not a word, not a cry. Something below language, a sound that belonged to a part of the human animal that predates speech, the part that operates on pure recognition of threat to what it loves most. The lattice of dark light holding the twins had been designed for adults. Lyra understood this afterward, when she had the distance to think about it clearly. The blood mage had constructed it for a standard binding, sufficient force to restrain a grown Omega, a soldier, a mage of moderate power. He had calibrated it for size without accounting for nature, which was a reasonable error to make about children. It was still an error. Emre stopped trying to move against the restraint. He went still, completely, voluntarily still. with his eyes closed and his chin dropped slightly, the posture he assumed when he was listening to something far away. Lyra had seen it 100 times, in the market when he sensed someone in pain 3 stalls over, in the lower city at night when he'd woken her to say the old man next door had stopped breathing and they should check. He was listening now to something enormous. Raya opened her eyes. They were gold. Not the bright green they had been every day of her 6 years of life. Gold, the deep burning gold of old metal and old fire, and the same impossible color that lived in her father's eyes when the wolf was close to the surface. It lasted only a moment, that color, but Lyra saw it and felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. "You hurt her," Raya said, not loudly, not with the wobbling rage of a frightened child, with the flat, certain delivery of a statement of fact that is also a verdict. The mage turned toward her, which was, Lyra would think later, the last mistake he ever made. The light didn't build. It didn't gather or swell or give warning. It simply arrived, erupting from both children simultaneously, golden and blinding and vast. A force that was not heat and not sound, but something that operated on a register below both, something that moved through stone and flesh and carefully constructed lies with equal and complete indifference to their substance. The binding shattered. Not gradually. Every filament of dark lattice simultaneously ceased to exist, disintegrating into particles of black smoke that the light consumed before they could settle. The mage staggered. The guards holding Lyra released her. Not by choice, she understood, but because the light had passed through them and found something, had illuminated something in each of them that their bodies reacted to involuntarily, a truth recognition that bypassed conscious decision entirely. One of them dropped to his knees. The other pressed both hands to his face with an expression of raw, unguarded horror at something only he could see. The mage raised his hands. She could see him pulling power, dark threads converging on him from the shadows, and the particular desperate gathering of a man who has spent his whole life controlling situations and is experiencing, for perhaps the first time, the sensation of a situation that does not care. The light found him anyway. It moved through his careful constructions, through the layered spell work and the blood-bound protections and the decades of accumulated dark craft. The way sunlight moves through smoke, not fighting any of it, simply making it irrelevant. He made a sound, once, and then the light consumed him where he stood. Not violently. With a completeness that was almost gentle, the way winter consumes a fire that has run out of fuel. One moment he existed. The next, the space where he had been was empty and faintly warm, the stones beneath slightly scorched in the outline of bare feet. Across the palace, in the places where hidden magic had been woven into walls and corridors and the mechanisms of locked rooms, things became suddenly visible. Spells designed to confuse, to misdirect, to make certain guards sleep deeply on certain nights. They surfaced and dissolved in the same instant, becoming briefly legible before they ceased to exist. 3 hidden passages revealed themselves in the east wing. A locked room in the council chambers opened of its own accord, releasing 7 years of carefully falsified documents into the corridor in a slow drift of parchment. And in the courtyard, where a black wolf fought through the remnants of a war party with brutal, tireless precision, Kyle felt it. Everything. A door inside him that had been sealed for 7 years opened all at once, and behind it was not darkness but the opposite. Memory. Clear and complete and unfiltered, the night he had been drugged and manipulated and robbed of something he had not known to look for in the years since. Lyra. The children. The specific, bone-deep recognition of what had been taken from him, and what it would mean to take it back. He raised his head. Across the courtyard, through smoke and dawn light and the settling dust of a battle already ending, Karen was still standing, watching the palace with an expression that had finally, completely, shed its smile. He was not defeated. He was recalculating. Chiron ran. Not immediately. There was a moment, perhaps 3 seconds long, where he stood in the courtyard and assessed what remained of his war party, and the man-shaped devastation moving toward him through the smoke. And his face performed the rapid calculations of someone determining whether a situation is recoverable. It was not recoverable. He ran. Kyle shifted mid-pursuit, the crack of it sharp in the settling dust, and was human again by the time he caught Chiron at the outer gate, which was a choice. Lyra understood. He could have taken him as the wolf. He chose not to. He chose hands, which meant he chose something slower and more deliberate and more personal. And when he caught Chiron by the collar and drove him against the iron gate with a force that rang through the metal like a struck bell, it was with the controlled precision of a man who has decided that this moment will be witnessed and remembered and documented by everyone present. "On your knees," Kale said. Chiron, to his credit, did not beg. He straightened what dignity he had left, which was not much, and met the king's eyes with the flat resignation of a man who had always known, somewhere underneath the planning and the scheming and the careful construction of other people's fates, that eventually the accounting would come. "You'll want answers," Chiron said. "I have them," Kale replied. "The documents your hidden room released this morning should cover the remaining gaps." Something moved across Chiron's face. Not quite surprise. The ghost of it. "Take him," Kale said, to the guard at his left. They took him. Lyra found the iron bar on the ground near the pillar archway, part of a broken gate mechanism, roughly the length of her forearm, and she didn't entirely remember picking it up. But she was holding it when the last of Chiron's soldiers made his decision about whether to surrender or run, and the fact that she was standing between him and her children apparently made the decision simple. He surrendered. She set the iron bar down carefully. Her hands were shaking. She noted this with a strange, distant calm, the way you note things about your own body when the emergency has passed and your nervous system is beginning the belated work of catching up to events. Raya appeared at her side and took her hand. "You were very brave, Mama," she said, with the solemn sincerity of a child delivering a considered verdict. Lyra looked down at her daughter, took in the golden curls, the green eyes that were completely, ordinarily green again, the small hand wrapped around hers with absolute confidence that it would be held. She sat down on the courtyard steps and pulled both children against her and held them until her hands stopped shaking. The palace settled around them slowly, the way places settle after violence. Not quickly, not completely, but in increments. The fires in the Eastern Tower were brought down by the 3rd hour. The falsified documents from the council chamber were collected and catalogued by palace scribes who moved through the corridors with the focused energy of people who understood that what they were handling would reshape the next several years of political history. The traitor guards were identified, 4 of them, and taken to the lower cells to await formal proceedings. Kyle found her in the small courtyard garden off the east wing, where a servant had brought the twins warm food and the particular exhausted piece of children who have burned through every extraordinary thing they contain, and are now simply hungry. He sat down across from them on the low stone bench. Not beside her, across, a distance that was respectful and also honest, the posture of a man who has things to say and wants to say them correctly. For a moment, no one spoke. Emre looked up from his food, studied the king with his characteristic careful attention, then went back to eating, which Lyra had learned to interpret as a positive sign. "They called me Dad," Kale said quietly. "They don't understand titles," Lyra said. "They only understand what they sense." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to decide anything. I want to be clear about that. Nothing that happened 7 years ago gives me a claim on your choices, and I have enough recovered memory now to understand exactly how those 7 years began." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry. For what Chiron arranged. For what you carried alone." She had not expected that. She had prepared for authority, for the machinery of royal claim and political necessity. She had not prepared for sorry, delivered without qualification, without the careful legal language of men protecting themselves while appearing generous. She didn't have an answer for it yet. Raya had climbed off the bench and crossed to Kale with the fearless directness she applied to everything. She placed her small hand on his knee and looked up at him with complete seriousness. "Are you staying this time?" she asked. Kyle looked at the girl for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Good," Raya said simply, and climbed up beside him with the casual confidence of someone claiming a seat that was always going to be theirs. Emre watched this. Then slowly he smiled. Lyra looked at her children, at the king sitting in a courtyard garden in the gray morning light with her daughter, settled against his side like she had always been there, and felt something shift in the careful architecture she had spent 6 years constructing around herself. Not collapse. Not surrender. The first cautious possibility of something built for staying rather than leaving. Peace settled over the palace like the smoke. Slowly, imperfectly, in layers. It would not last. 3 days later, a courier arrived from the Northern Territories carrying a sealed message with no signature and no housemark, only a symbol pressed into black wax that Kale's senior archivist recognized with an expression that drained the color from his face. The message contained 4 words. "We felt the children." Lyra read it once, set it down on the table between herself and Kyle without speaking. Outside the window, the twins were in the garden below. Raya chasing something small and probably imaginary through the hedgerows. Emre sitting cross-legged in the grass, with his eyes closed and his face tilted toward the sky, listening to things none of them could hear. Beautiful. Extraordinary. Visible now, in ways they had never been before. The world, it turned out, had been paying attention, and it was only just beginning to decide what to do about what it had seen. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.